I was chatting with a friend yesterday who's been eyeing a new gaming rig but keeps second-guessing whether to shell out for a pre-built or try his hand at building one himself. He's got a decent monitor, a solid internet connection, and a library of games that range from fast-paced shooters to more demanding RPGs, yet he's worried about spending money on something that might not actually meet his needs. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. That hesitation is exactly what I hear from a lot of folks when the gaming desktop market feels saturated with flashy specs and vague promises. What makes a gaming PC worth the price isn't just the headline numbers, it's how those numbers translate into everyday play, how much hassle you have to deal with, and whether the machine will still feel snappy a year from now. For someone who wants to dive straight into a game night without fiddling with cables, BIOS settings, or troubleshooting driver conflicts, a ready Togo system can be a real lifesaver. But the flip side is that a pre-built can lock you into certain components that become bottlenecks when newer titles start demanding more VRAM or higher clock speeds. So the question I kept asking myself while testing the HELLOLAND gaming desktop was, does it hit the sweet spot between plug-and-play convenience and lasting performance? Let's start with the core of the machine, an AMD Ryzen 7 8700F. 8 cores and 16 threads give you solid multitasking power, which shows up the moment you launch a game while also having Discord, a web browser, and a music player open. In real-world tests, I found the CPU handling titles like Valorant and Elden Ring without any stutter, and it even managed to keep frame rates stable while I was streaming my gameplay to Twitch. The base clock of 4.1 GHz feels responsive, though the lack of an integrated graphics chip means you're completely dependent on the GPU. That's not a problem here because the box comes with a GeForce RTX 5050 equipped with 8 GB of GDDR6. Now, the RTX 5050 sits in an interesting place. It's not a flagship like the RTX 3070, but it's definitely a step up from older GTX cards. In 1080p gaming, it delivered smooth 60+ FPS in titles such as Fortnite, Apex Legends, and even more demanding games like Cyberpunk 2077 when I dialed medium settings. If you're aiming for a 144Hz monitor, you'll still see respectable frame rates in many competitive shooters, though you'll have to compromise on ultra-high textures in the most graphically intensive titles. The 8 GB of VRAM is enough for the current generation of games at 1080p, but if you plan to push into 1440p with ultra settings, you might start seeing texture pop-ins. Memory and storage are where the machine feels surprisingly future-ready. 16 GB of DDR5 RAM running at 6000 MHz provides a noticeable jump in load times compared to older DDR4 kits. I measured game load screens in Assassin's Creed Valhalla and they dropped by roughly a second compared to a comparable DDR4 setup I own. The 1TB NVMe SSD is another strong point. It's fast enough that you barely hear any delay when launching games or moving large files. With a single terabyte you can comfortably house a solid library of AAA titles, plus a few creative apps if you dabble in video editing or 3D modeling. One of the quieter wins is the liquid-cooled solution. Many pre-built towers rely on standard air coolers that can get noisy under load. The closed-loop system in this HELLOLAND model kept the CPU temps in the low 60 SC during a marathon Red Dead Redemption 2 session, and the fans stayed at a low pitch that was almost inaudible from across the room. If you share a space with roommates or a partner who's sensitive to fan noise, that's a genuine comfort. The power supply is a 650W unit, which is adequate for the components as they stand. It gives you some headroom if you want to swap the RTX 5050 for a modest upgrade like an RTX 3060, but you'll start to feel the limits if you think about moving to a higher-tier GPU or adding multiple drives later on. The case itself is a matte black tower that isn't the smallest on the market, so you'll need a decent amount of floor or desk space. It's not a showpiece with RGB lighting, which is fine if you prefer a low-profile look, but it also means the aesthetic isn't a selling point. So, who should consider buying this machine? If you're a gamer who wants a hassle-free setup, wants to start playing right out of the box, and primarily targets 1080p or 1440p gaming, this is a solid match. It's also a good fit for streamers who need a reliable CPU for encoding while the GPU handles the graphics, and for anyone who isn't looking to constantly swap out parts. The fact that it's assembled in the USA and comes tested means you're less likely to encounter a dead component on arrival, which can be a pain when you're ordering from overseas. On the other hand, if you're an enthusiast chasing 4K resolutions,